I think I started thinking about not enough at a really young age. Probably in early childhood and always wanting more candy and more play and more swimming and those things. But I'd say the enough idea occurred to me when I was 17. My mom had had a long-term boyfriend who sold a Jewish deli for $300,000. This is in the mid 80s. And I remember just doing the math in my own, 17-year-old head and saying, oh, wow, $300,000. If I invest that at 10%, I could live on about $2,000 a month for the rest of my life. That would be enough. And I got this idea in my head that, like, okay, get to a certain amount of money and then everything will be perfect. Everything, I won't ever stress or suffer again. And then a few years later, the primary mentor of my adult life came into my life. His name is Robert Strock, and he was a psychotherapist and an investor for many decades. And he had done some writing on something he called one's economic satiation point, which was kind of similar. But it was the amount of wealth that was enough that you really then realize that accumulating more than that or consuming more than that wouldn't lead to more satiation. It wouldn't lead to more contentment or fulfillment or quality of life. So that's kind of the earliest experiences. But more recently, in January of 2020, I started feeling deeply how I was making more income and having more net worth than I'd ever had in my life. And yet I was still striving. I still had this kind of excessive motivation to get somewhere. And so my thought was, where was I trying to get? And why was I still trying to get somewhere?
Yes, I connect with a lot of things that Brent said. For me, strangely as it may sound, bankruptcy was the main turning point for me, or the main sort of pivot point. So I had a very comfortable middle class upbringing, never really lacked for anything, came out of university, started what became quite a sizable company, and then just before the age of 30, lost everything. And everything meaning financially. And that was a really eye-opening experience for me because I went from having, a very comfortable lifestyle to suddenly having hardly any money. And it really made me realize that I was hardly any less happy. So that for me fundamentally changed my relationship with money. I came to see money much more as a means to an end. And also it changed my needs. So my needs became a lot simpler and never really returned to the sort of needs that I was striving for before. So that was for me the main change, as it were, the main eye opener. Yeah, so the big change in that respect came that about 8 years ago, or no, maybe longer than that, I was invited to manage a single family office when I exited my last company. And so, family office wise, it's been a very gradual journey. So, when I started managing the family office, the quid pro quo was that 10% of the profits would go into a foundation, which I founded. That over the course of time became 20%. We also started investing part of the wealth in impactful investments. Um, and really, yeah, after a while, so this journey progressed, and maybe sort of 3 years ago, we started asking these questions of, are we doing enough? It never really felt like we were doing enough. But also inspired by the results, the principal of the family office, Peter, decided that, the 20% of philanthropy and probably 20% of assets invested in impactful investments was really rather arbitrary. And so at a certain stage, he sort of said, well, why don't you just use all the wealth and all the profits and work out how to do as much good as possible with that? So that was a major turning point for us in terms of, he realized that, the zeros were just extra zeros on the balance sheet. And so, yeah, that's a major step that we've been working on. And the sort of next step now that we're looking at is about spending down.
Yeah. So for me, I resonate with that. And I also just want to say, like, I'm not there yet. The extra zeros on the balance sheet, for me, they do bring some security and, some sense of security. And yet I'm questioning that. So I'm not, ready to look at the next step of down spending, but I am looking at kind of, I have already looked at and committed to, like, kind of leveling off and not accumulating. But I think it's important for viewers to know that like we can be at really different spots on the journey, and that there isn't a hierarchy here. Um, for me, the progression of my enough journey really shifted on a meditation retreat about 2 years ago. I was reflecting on how simple that was. It's a 10-day silent retreat in the middle of the Colorado desert, and very simple food and no entertainment, none of the usual enjoyments or distractions of my life or the things I crave most. And yet I was more joyful, more at peace than really any other time during the year. And so kind of like your experience of having your financial wealth go away, Robert, and finding that your happiness hadn't changed, I had that kind of aha moment, although in a different way and in a sort of temporary way. Um, but what it made me look at, I remember in my meditation journal drawing this little graph of the last 10 years and sort of roughly how much income had gone up. I think it had tripled, and how much net worth had gone up. It had probably also tripled. And consumption had done that same thing. Our houses had gotten nicer, our vacations had gotten nicer. And then I said, okay, I'm at that point, I think around 50. I'm hopefully going to live a few more decades. Income and net worth keep going up at these paces. What if I flatten the consumption part? And then all of a sudden, the space between those two lines becomes this surplus, becomes this amount that I can really try and do the most amount of good with. And that idea just really appealed to me, because it's also, I often get much more deeply in touch with my compassion and my empathy for those who are suffering when I'm in retreats like that. Um, and so then I came back from that retreat, shared that experience with my wife, who said, "Oh, good, I'm relieved. Like I've been wanting us to simplify for a while," which was great, because I think if she was really attached to consumption increasing indefinitely, it would have been a lot harder. But that started a much deeper dive for me, in which I started journaling extensively in a Word doc that I called the Enough Project, and that's kind of where this name came from. Um, and doing a lot of very intricate financial planning work, and how much is enough at varying levels of lifestyle, and how much would that allow us to be impactful with, both on the philanthropy side and on the investing side. Um, and by invest, I mean most impact investing, or much of it, can earn enough return to fund the lifestyle, but some of it is very catalytic or highly risky, and so I wanted to evaluate that aspect. Like, could I afford to be very catalytic, or take zero returns on certain high impact things? Um, and then, over the last 2 years, I've just been working closely with coaches and other mentors around how do I maximize the effectiveness of this impact. And we have now had some experience of giving away orders of magnitude more than we ever gave away before. And I thought I'd have a lot more kind of fear and regret afterwards. I thought I'd be like, whoa, that was kind of too much. And what happens if the world, goes to hell, and I'm not never going to get that money back? And it's been the opposite. I've had so much fulfillment and joy from the giving and from the results of some of it. I'd say the main thing I've learned so far is that there's a lot of different buckets through which you can have impact, and it's quite easy to just do something like align one's portfolio to do no harm, and then sort of say, okay, that's good. I'm a good citizen, pat myself on the back, and I don't own these kinds of bad companies. And that's enough. And I think so for me, recognizing that this is a never-ending journey, and that if I want to increase my effectiveness, I, I I'm constantly learning and constantly realizing where my own blind spots are and where my own inner contradictions are. And one of the places that, for philanthropic giving, there's a lot of different motivations. Like for me, actually experiencing that I'm making a difference, being in the field and looking in someone's eyes, and, or getting their gratitude perhaps, that's something I enjoy. But I recognize that that kind of makes the impact about me. It's like it's giving me the warm glow, or giving me the good feeling of oh, I'm a good person, I made a difference in this person's life. What if that's not the most impact I can have? What if the most impact is on some future generation that isn't even alive yet, or someone who is alive but lives in a place where I'll never really meet them or know about them? Shouldn't I have one bucket of my philanthropy at least that is focused on just maximizing impact, irrespective of the recognition or even just the warm feeling that I can get by experiencing the difference I'm making? And my answer to that is absolutely, that I should aim for the most impact I can with a lot of the resources. We've also used philanthropy with our family, our sons who are now 21 and 18. I mean, since they were, I want to say, 8 and 6, we've involved them in our giving and had conversations. So it's been a bonding experience for our family. And and that some of that giving I want to have continue, but sometimes when, if you're really going deep into the stuff, it's a lot harder to do with multiple people because one person or maybe two people will take it really seriously and do a lot of the reading and the research and learning. And, a lot of that, like I said, is a personal journey and looking at one's inner contradictions and owning up to one's motivations. And then also just kind of a lot of us do our giving, because of friends or family asking us to support causes they believe in, and there's an I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of component to it. So for me, it's not so much about like seeing all those and saying, oh, those are bad motivations to give. I just shouldn't do that anymore. I should just do the most good I can. Because I think there's natural human needs and inclinations that kind of giving satisfies. But I think making a very explicit decision about how much to allocate to each of those buckets, rather than just letting it be an implicit kind of inertia, which is how I think certainly how I gave for most of my history, most of my years, is a really important step. And then defining how much do I want in this kind of impartial, impact maximizing bucket, um, and letting that truly be impartial and meeting those other human needs with these other buckets has been the biggest learning.
Yeah, Brent, I really connect with a number of things that you say there. So it's definitely a learning journey, and for us now, it's been 3 years, and it definitely doesn't seem to end anytime soon. I mean, it really fundamentally changed the way that we relate to the wealth, and in a way that was very liberating. So it really wasn't about holding on to it, for us, it's very much become a means to an end now, and that end is to do as much good as possible. And it was a real eye opener that, how much impact we can create at no cost to ourselves. And I put cost in inverted commas, because our lifestyles haven't changed significantly, right? So it's not like we drive a smaller car or live in a smaller house. I mean, we were already happy with the place we were at. And so really it's dramatically increased our impact, um, without majorly changing anything. So I think that's a really good one. It also comes with the freedom for us to optimally allocate for impact, because suddenly all avenues have become available, right? It's not like, okay, our investments need to make market rate return, whatever that means, or we can combine, um, any type of combination of investments to try and do as much good as possible. And again, that resonates with what you said, Brent, about really trying to work out how to do that. Um, it has also been interesting, that we've learned that we need to do longer term planning. So we actually, now plan way longer into the future. And that's really given us that feeling of sort of stability as well. So we know we can meet our obligations whilst using all the wealth to do as much good as possible. Yeah, so it's interesting because it does come with a set of challenges. Obviously, Brent, you referred to the sort of impartiality and those sort of things. But also, I think for us, especially when we made the decision, it was very much about, what do we do with the children? So Peter's children. Um, and that was a really interesting and again, very eye-opening because we literally asked them, what would you like to inherit? And obviously gave them time to think about it. It wasn't putting them on the spot. And the answer they came back with, and this was again inspired by the impact that we were already having with the limited amount that was allocated to doing as much good as possible, was really that they didn't want anything. They wanted us to use the wealth for good. So apart from some sort of minimum requirements like never going hungry and having a roof over their heads, which was sort of relatively easily solvable. Obviously, it took us some time to solve, but with housing and basic income, we sort of tackled that. But that was definitely a learning. That was definitely a challenge. The other challenge was choosing between all the different options, because the sort of arbitrary restrictions that we had initially of having very neat buckets of philanthropy and sort of impactful investments and traditional investments, those sort of all blended into one. And then it became about, what's the opportunity cost of making one investment or grant over something else, because you can't do everything. And that's where we found professional advice extremely helpful in helping us with that, with our thinking. And also, COVID has been a really interesting period, because although mentally we'd already sort of separated ourselves from the wealth, um, you still felt this heavy pain of loss with investments being affected by COVID and this sort of financial loss. And it was really interesting for us to dive more deeply into why were we feeling this loss, even though we'd already separated ourselves from the wealth. It also forced us already to start spending down, because obviously giving away all our profits currently, when those profits were affected, we had to spend down. And so that was again a really interesting challenge to look at. But it also really helped us to crystallize a very clear goal, because last year we were feeling very down about the sort of negative financial consequences of COVID, but we had the most impactful year that we've ever had. And if that is our true goal, then it's really interesting to see that. So it really helped us crystallize our priorities, and not attach too much value to the financial losses and really focus on what's important.
It's amazing, Robert, to hear you say that about last year, because I had a really similar experience that, as asset prices went down so dramatically in the spring, here in North America anyway, um, the I had some fear about the financial ramifications of it, and that was the exact time that I was really in the nuts and bolts of the financial analysis and figuring out that, oh wow, we could give away 7 times as much as our previous high water mark, and then questioning myself like that. No one knew when it was going to turn around, and if markets were going to kind of stabilize, and certainly I didn't think they would come back as fast as they did. Um, but committed to the impact early, and then ended up having the most impactful year we've ever had, not just because of giving away a lot more than we'd ever given away, but the focus on efficacy and the focus on evidence was not new for us, but was employed across much more of our resources. So the challenges for me have been, well, I already said, my wife was really on board, is really on board with the whole enough project idea and with leveling off and even downscaling the consumption. Um, the family as a whole has had a harder time, with this kind of how do we do the most good possible? Because there's a certain false precision or overconfidence that can be implicit in that question, in thinking one knows the answer to that question. And so, I've had to be really honest that I don't know. But I'm pursuing. I'm trying to directionally get more precise. I'm trying to directionally gather more information without getting stuck in analysis paralysis. And I'm trying to be humble and not overconfident that this is definitely the place to do the most good. But as you said, in pursuing better data and evidence, we have also been able to identify places where our money does 18 times as much good in a particular cause area than the typical donation does, for example. And that data comes from multiple peer-reviewed studies, let's say. So being able to do a lot more impact with the same resources, and then also, like you said, experiencing that my quality of life was better. It wasn't worse. In a way, there's almost like a kind of emptiness. I almost think of it like an addiction quality of emptiness to being able to consume anything you want. Even in the grocery store, I was in the store the other day, and I was putting myself on a little bit of a budget just to kind of like feel that. And it felt better. It felt better than just like, well, I can buy anything, even if it's the, little $8, jar of some craft deli food or something. Like, I'm actually going to think about that. Um, so another challenge that I've really experienced is that there are competing inner voices for me. This is not, I'm not like the Enough Project voice doesn't run the show inside me. There's still a fear voice that comes up that says, well, what if the world goes into economic collapse or if there's societal unrest? How am I going to deal with that? Should I have resources? Should I, have invested in a big regenerative farm somewhere that we can all go off to and be safe? And my answer is no, or a lot less than I used to want that, because I've recognized we all leave this life with nothing. And that in large part, my desire for security through money is a complete fallacy, that there's no permanent security from anything in this life. And so I'm just kind of putting off the kind of gut punch of death to the extent I let myself believe that money is making me more secure or totally secure, let's say, because it certainly brings some security. But I think that level is a lot lower than I used to think it is. And so I have that voice, the fear voice, and then I have this compassionate voice that realizes I can do so much good with these resources. And so I literally kind of facilitate inner conversations between these voices and kind of, okay, would this satisfy you, fear voice? Like if we did this and this and this, then, if the world really goes to hell, then we're going to have to downscale our lifestyle a lot more than we might want to, but we'll still be fine. But in 90% of the scenarios, we're going to be more than fine, and look how much more good we can do. And so that's kind of where I've landed with it. But, this fear voice still comes up from time to time, and so those inner conversations continue. The Enough Project started, like I said, for me with this just journaling in a document that got very long very fast because there was a lot going on internally for me. And then I shared it with Robert, and he's obviously been on an Enough journey with Peter for a long time. Oh, sorry, let me do that again. Um, so it started for me with journaling in this Word document that I called the Enough Project, which I then shared with you, Robert, and obviously you and Peter have been on this journey for a long time, and so just we had such a synergy about it, and like, wow, you think that too, and you're wrestling with this too, and how are you grappling with this issue? And so we just started sharing more of our conversation and more of our writings, and then having some one-on-one conversations with other people, for the most part wealth holders. And then I'm in the financial advisory profession, and so I've been having this conversation with a number of other big industry folks and very high net worth clients who have recognized something like this, that there's, surely there must be an enough, or surely there must be more than this now that I've far surpassed what I thought my financial goals were, for some. And so, there are some deep questions that we've just begun asking, or I'll say I've just begun asking, that, many people haven't asked yet, and that I haven't asked fully, at least of myself yet. So what is enough is the first one. When have I got enough? Do I need to keep accumulating more? And if so, like, what is that voice in me that wants to accumulate more forever? What's it really after? In terms of that idea of permanent security that I mentioned before, that tends to be what it's after for affluent folks, for middle class, upper class folks. I by no means want to suggest that, that the vast majority of humanity is pursuing more resources because they desperately need it. There's so many people without enough, without housing, without food, without healthcare and education, and so by no means am I saying that, that those folks should be asking these questions at this point on their journey. But for those of us with enough or more than enough, I think that kind of survival treadmill just continues unless we really check it and ask these questions. Um, and then, I mean, I'd love you to speak to this more, Robert, because I think it's really so much more in your wheelhouse. But once we've identified that, oh, I do have enough, and then, kind of, I'd say another important part of the Enough project that I've built out within my company, but that we haven't really formalized as part of what could be offered out there to folks who are interested in this journey is how do you figure that out? How do you actually do the rigorous financial analysis to know what enough wealth is to meet whatever the threshold is of your goals and needs and security, so that then you can quantify what's available to do good. Um, but yeah, I'd love you, Robert, to speak a bit more to what you then do with the wealth once you've identified that there's a surplus, in terms of, the amount of good you can do.
Yeah, no, Brent, and I think your document, especially having shared that with others, has just been so inspiring, and it's sort of resonated with other people. And I think that that really has given us both the belief as well that there is a potential win-win opportunity, and it might even be huge, right? So it's a way of using wealth and driving more wealth to contribute significantly to tackling these serious problems, but also this real increased sense of fulfillment that both of us have felt, and that other wealth holders could potentially feel in using their wealth for something meaningful, and actually realizing that they have enough. It's such a powerful realization to know that you have enough, and can change your relationship with wealth to use it for something that brings so much fulfillment. So that's really where we're at the moment in terms of exploring, let's say, how we can start this conversation more broadly than just the sort of one-on-ones that we've been having, and to see if we can add more value in that respect. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, I think we can go into philanthropy in more detail, but that would be a whole other conversation. But the irony is definitely not lost on us, right? Being in rooms where we talk about equality, and ourselves and many of the others in those rooms being not in the top 1%, but in the top 0.01% or something like that. And to us, that for a long time felt very uncomfortable and inconsistent as well. So there was this feeling of knowing that we could be doing so much more, and I think that made us less comfortable with the wealth and made having the wealth less enjoyable. So I do believe that wealth is often the elephant in the room that nobody mentions, and that it really definitely should be a fundamental part of the discussion. But what do you think, Brent?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for me, I don't view philanthropy as a pursuit of equality in the sense of everybody having the same number of resources. I do pursue equity with my philanthropy, and to me, they're very different things. So, equity isn't about an equal number of resources, it's about lifting up those who have been most left behind. Um, so, like I said before, those who have no health care, or, I mean, there's a zillion issues, obviously, but we look at the climate change issue, and there's, climate migration and climate refugees are going to be, by and large, equatorial people in developing countries who have very, very few resources. I mean, where you are, Robert, in the Netherlands, you guys have shown us that developed countries can build dikes, and can stave off rising sea levels. That doesn't mean there may not be crop failures and other things that affect developed countries, and certainly the poor in developed countries. But for me, it's really about pursuing equity. But I absolutely agree that wealth is the elephant in the room. And the really tricky part about this is that no one wants to feel shamed into this conversation. No one wants to feel someone else looking at them and judging the amount of wealth they have or what they're doing with their wealth. And so this really has to be a calling in and not a calling out, in my opinion. The invitation is that for us, for Robert and me and Peter and the other folks we've been starting to talk to, this it's been an upgrade of life. It's not a sacrifice or a downgrade, and it's not kind of a socialist concession in my view. It's really about my quality of life has become enhanced by recognizing I have enough, I have more than enough. I'm going to continue very likely to have much, much more than enough, and I can do an extraordinary amount of good with that. Um, and so, and the extraordinary amount of good is directly related to that concept of equity, that concept of looking for where the need is the greatest and the most neglected, and where I can have, the most impact with my resources. So, um, but I run in a lot of circles like you, Robert, where there's a lot of wealthy folks, and there's often a lot of discussion about systems change and political change, and this should happen and that should happen, and everybody should da 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 da, but not as much introspection about, wow, where are my own attachments to my money and my real estate and my, consumption and maybe the estate plan I've set up for my children isn't what you described before, Robert, where it's just basically a roof over their heads and not going hungry. Maybe what I've wanted is for my kids to have a nice condominium on the west side of LA and be able to take a couple of vacations a year. And that's a very different level. Now that might be fine. Like I want that to be okay. I don't want to feel like I'm less than you because I've set a higher standard, and that means I'm allocating less as a percentage to having, to doing the most good possible. And so I think this is a really important thing, that like this not be presented as a hierarchy, and that there's the sort of best enough project person is the one who simplifies their needs the most. Because I think then we're just getting caught in the same ego trap of trying to accumulate as much as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Brent. And I think it is very important that this conversation is approached in the right way, and that we really don't, this doesn't become about guilt, whether it's guilt about, that expensive vacation or other sort of things that everybody can define their levels, but that we do ask these fundamental questions, because it can be so enriching. Like you said, the experience for us has been 100% positive, with some nice challenging moments as well.
Well, I'll start with I I welcome anyone to reach out who wants to, who's kind of serious about wanting to explore this in a deep way. And I'll just share also that it's not for the faint of heart. That I'm really, I'm interested in folks who really want to kind of face the inner resistance and those multiple voices that that come up uh, when when you're trying to grapple with these competing needs inside yourself. So for me, lots of different feelings have come up. Fear has come up, grandiosity and excitement has come up, wanting to get recognition and approval from people for like, oh wow, Brent's doing this cool work, and you should read his document, and it's amazing, isn't he a great guy? And like so, just being really honest about the multiple motivations that are behind this, is I think not for the faint of heart, and important, and very worth it. Really worth it to question that, so that we're not just running kind of unconsciously on a hamster wheel for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, Brent, and sorry. Yeah. Yeah, Brent, I really love your honesty in that respect as well, because it definitely isn't for the faint of heart. And we're still working out how to structure this project, as it were. But I think, for us, it just feels really important to get it off the ground and then see where it goes, and to start this conversation in a positive way. So yeah, if anybody is interested in joining this conversation and really asking these questions, there's the website, obviously, which has been shared by Synergos, the enough-project.org. And do feel free to reach out to Brent or myself, to see where you can join this conversation. I think it's been really fulfilling. It's well worth it, and I'm interested to see where it goes. Yeah. Well, Brent, it's been amazing to have this conversation with you, and obviously the journey that we've been having. And I hope it's inspired the audience as well to think at a deeper level about enough, and hopefully be interested in joining the conversation.
Yeah, Robert, thank you so much for being a thought partner on this journey with me and for being willing to look at yourself and be self-deprecating in moments. Like I love that about you, that you're very serious and analytical and hardworking, and yet you can have a good laugh at your own expense. So I really appreciate that, and I think that's an important part of this whole enough project thing, so we don't get on our high horse and think that we're saving the world alone.
Yeah, and thank you for the Synergos GPC for being open to host this conversation as well and to allow us to share some of what we've been going through.